Hello, welcome again. This week we're on chapter 10 of volume 3 of the Lam Rim Chenmo by Lama Tsong-kha-pa. So before we start, let's just do what we can to improve or to develop or to remember our motivation, which is to consider not just ourselves and what we're looking for, but also what all beings are looking for, which is to find lasting peace or lasting happiness, and to avoid suffering, and to recognize that one of the ways which we can do that, or the way we can do that, is through becoming a Buddha. And by being a Buddha, we work spontaneously and effortlessly to benefit everybody around us. So one of the qualities of a Buddha, of a Mahayana Buddha, is this ability to lift people up and from their suffering or their lack of contentment, to secure that happiness. So this is a worthy goal for us, and we recognize that we can do that. We ourselves can become Buddhas, we can become enlightened, and so in order to do that, we need to learn the path of the bodhisattva, the bodhisattva, the being who wishes to who's decided to journey on the path to enlightenment. And so to do that, we need to understand the 6 perfections that make up the deeds of a bodhisattva, the six activities that make up somebody who's committed to Buddhahood. And of those, the 6th is insight or wisdom. And that's what we're talking about. So we should listen or to consider carefully how best to bring this insight, this wisdom into our minds. So last week we talked roughly about, Rinpoche talked about the stages of entry into the path of insight through recognizing the truth, the 4 noble truths, and especially by recognizing the truth of suffering, which is often very hard for us initially to recognize, because we think, oh, well, I'm not suffering. All this Buddhism saying we're suffering. I'm not suffering. My life's fine. Thank you very much. So what's all this, everybody suffering sort of stuff? And without wanting to go through everything that we've already talked about over the last year and a half or so, the answer to that question is, well, while we still do not see clearly, while we are not able to see the world in the way in which it really is, while we are the universe is obscured to us with a lack of clarity, then we are prone to make misjudgments. And when we make those misjudgments, they create toxic environments, both inside us, internally, in our minds, but also in terms of our external contributions to the world. So even though we might think that we're doing well, and we might think that we're happy, what we're doing is we're actually increasing a degree of toxicity within ourselves and outside, while we are not clear about the way in which the world and the way in which we see the world differs. So when we begin to recognize actually what the issues are, and we do this by studying the 12 interdependent links, or the 12 the way in which everything is interdependent, and causes and consequences are all interlinked, then we begin to recognize where we are making our mistakes. And when we begin to see how we are making these mistakes clearly, then we stop making them. We start really recognizing the toxicity of our presumptions, of our minds, and also of our actions. And we're not wishing to be toxic or cause suffering. This is what this means, for ourselves or for others. Then we begin to see just how pervasive suffering really is and has been, and then we can begin to eliminate it. So it's not saying, oh, I've got, I have a headache all the time. This is much more subtle than that. It's really to do with the basis, the cause of that headache, or the way in which we begin to establish these negative cycles of sort of toxic behavior, which we then suffer the consequences of. So moving on to establishing the reality of the world, which is this idea that's mentioned many times. For anybody who's half familiar with Buddhism, it's very hard to avoid hearing about something called shunyata, or emptiness, or selflessness, or the suchness, or thatness, or voidness, or the void. All of these things really mean the same thing. They're just different words for the same thing. They're all synonyms. And importantly, these synonyms are pointing to something which is not the presence of something. Emptiness isn't the presence of something, it's the absence of something. So something that we think is there is not actually there. And this is really important. So the main aspect of what is being taught, and was taught by Buddha in his second sermon, is that we imagine there to be something that isn't actually there. And what we need to do is to identify exactly what it is that isn't there. Otherwise, we will miss the point. And this is what Rinpoche wants to talk about this week, this session, in this chapter 10. So, first of all, what we need to do is to recognize, he says, is the object that we are negating, that we're identifying. In other words, the thing that we think is there that isn't there. And he says why he's going to explain why it's important for us to identify what it is that isn't there. And he's also going to talk about how within Buddhism and within our own thoughts, we can think that we have an idea about what it is that isn't there, but be mistaken about it. So first of all, let's move on to this. He says, when we let's say we're at a party, there are lots of people present, and you're looking for your friend Bill, and somebody says Bill isn't here. It's important that they know which Bill it is that you're talking about, because there may be several Bills, but the person that you're looking for is a specific Bill, and when you're asking, this person's aware of who the Bill is that you're talking about, and they're able to say, no, Bill's gone, Bill's left, Bill's no longer present in the party. So if we want to establish whether or not Bill is present, we need to know which Bill it is that we're talking about, and the particular characteristics, if you like, or the particular features of that Bill is that is missing and not present in the party anymore. So likewise, when we hear about emptiness or selflessness or the lack of intrinsic existence or the lack of essence or essencelessness, voidness, and so on, I won't repeat myself, we have to identify just what that self or that lack or that intrinsic or that essence or that whatever it is that isn't present. Right? Otherwise, it's like, well, there are lots of different, for instance, in Western philosophy, the word essence is used a lot, and it means different things according to which philosophies we're talking about. Now, I said this isn't about philosophy, and it's not. It's about establishing a path to liberation. And it's important for us to recognize that what we are trying to do is to find a way of being able to recognize that when these words are used in Buddha's teachings and in translations, what is being specifically meant. And Rinpoche had the same issue. Although he was around in the 14th century in Tibet, he needed to be clear that the translations from Sanskrit and those themselves from Pali was still identifying the correct meaning of what was meant that is not present. What is the world empty of? To be, when we talk about emptiness, we're talking about the absence of something. That's all that the emptiness means in Buddhism, is this absence. So it's saying absence, like something's not present, and voidness. It's not the presence of it's not talking about space. It's talking about the lack of something, something very, very specific. So we need to be very clear about the way in which these words are used. Shunyata, or shunya just means empty, and that's why we have the word emptiness translated. Sometimes it means, and sometimes it's been translated as the void or space, and likewise. So we need to know what this actually means, because it's not talking about the vacuum of space or the emptiness of a milk bottle that doesn't have any milk in it because somebody drank it earlier on. So we're not talking about the emptiness of milk in the milk bottle. We're talking about the emptiness of something specific. We need to know what that thing is. So this is what we need to identify, knowing that it doesn't exist, knowing what it is that doesn't exist. It says if we don't have a clear concept of what it is that doesn't exist, then we won't have an accurate idea about its negation, its lack of presence. Yeah, we won't know which bill it is that's missing from the party. And then he cites Shantideva, who says, without contacting the entity that is imputed, you will not apprehend the absence of that entity, which is just a sort of sort of rather complicated way of saying if you don't know which bill it is that's missing from the party, then you won't be able to identify whether or not bill is missing. But I'm using a metaphor, so. So then Rinpoche says, you know, there are many things that we can find in fact, a limitless diversity of objects for which this quality of lacking or emptiness arises. But in the end, they come together at this in terms of the root. The same sort of thing that is they're empty of is similar enough for us to be able to say that once we've recognized the lack of this object in that thing, then we'll be able to recognize it in everything else. It's a transferable understanding. So it's like once I know that Bill's no longer in this party, I'm not necessarily sure that Bill's not present in the party. But if I find out that Bill's dead, then I will know that it doesn't matter whichever party I go to, Bill will not be present. Right? So it's this sort of distinction here, as he's saying, once we recognize emptiness, the emptiness of one object, we'll be able to recognize the emptiness of any object. However, he says, or he says, I was translated here, moreover, if you're not 100% sure of the death of Bill, if you're not 100% sure that this emptiness is complete, is fulfilled, there'll be some sort of possible subtle remainder of some sort of a little bit left, which is enough for you to not be free. So we need to remove it utterly, whatever this is, which we're working on very slowly. If we haven't removed it completely, if we still think there's a sort of a hint of it, then we are blocked from liberation. We're blocked from our enlightenment because we will still have something that we can cling on to. So it's this clinging on to this nature of binding or thirst for this thing that is keeping us bound in samsara, which is, we can learn that from the 12 interdependent links, which we talked about in a few semesters ago. So this one thing is saying that if we understand, if our understanding is not thorough and we don't quite eliminate enough, then we are still stuck in samsara. And then he says, if we overextend our reputation, in other words, if we overextend the missing, if we think that everybody called Bill is no longer available, we've missed a point too, and we can start making decisions which cause us. In fact, in many ways, once we overstep negation in terms of emptiness, we lose our moral compass. And this is absolutely relevant. So this is why so many other traditions, within Buddhism too, have often tended to not choose Madhyamaka, the middle way school, because of the risk of overextending our negation. And as soon as we do that, we lose our moral compass. And not only do we is enlightenment closed to us, but even any sense of goodness or any value to our lives is missing completely. So this aspect here is really, really important. It's if anything, we can say, well, we can still do good if we don't quite eliminate enough. We won't achieve enlightenment, but we can still achieve some beneficial qualities. But if we overextend our negation, we lose everything, right? So this aspect is very, very important for us to know precisely how much how much to identify in terms of if we identify too little, we're still missing the point. We identify too much, then we make a fool of ourselves. So the word for these two in terms of this text and this translation, which is not necessarily very clear, because unfortunately there are these words used in Western philosophy and they don't mean that, is there's what's known as a nihilistic view. This is where we overextend our view. This is where we begin to think there's no basis for there's no substantial actual basis for doing good things, for instance, and then there's the eternalist view, which is, or if you like, the essential view, which is where we haven't negated enough, we haven't noticed enough. So this is sort of like the idea, going back to Bill, that if we have heard that Bill's dead, but we still sort of think we might bump into him at a party, then we haven't really negated enough, because we're not really sure that there might be a party where, like Elvis, if they say, Elvis is still alive. So, maybe around the party I might bump into Elvis, right? So that sort of thing, that sort of mind, that is like not really negating enough. And then the other one, which is, well, I'll never meet a Bill again. There are no Bills left. It's sort of just missing the point, and actually just makes yourself look idiotic. Go into a party and say, well, there are no Bills here. And they say, well, he's Bill. And it's like, oh, no, he's not, because there are no Bills left. This is where we've overextended our negation of the Bill. Right. So in this sense, really what we're saying is we need to be very, very clear about that level. So the first one we're going to look at is the second one, right? Which is where we overextend. Our identification. And this is normally the case, actually, and especially when we're learning or beginning to understand insight, and we hear about selflessness and so on, is we begin to sort of think, oh, there's no self, therefore, there's none of this, there's none of that. So this sort of understanding is based on the idea when we hear about something not being present, we imagine it to be it not to be at all. So what he's going to do now, Rinpoche is going to do, is he's going to use some of the ideas that we come to ourselves as students or practitioners, and he's going to then say, look, this is how we might think about it, and then he's going to point out how they're mistaken, how our views are mistaken. So one of the aspects is that many of us who are hoping to be practicing as middle way practitioners, or middle way in terms of our path, we say that what we recognize is that all phenomena, everything in the universe, including ourselves, our minds, everything we can see or hear, our Buddhas, the truth, and so on, everything, all language, everything, in the end is refuted, is demonstrated not to be true by using this rational analysis, by using this analysis which examines rationally. And then, for instance, and they say what we do is we sort of say, this can't be produced, it can't be not produced, and so on. And because of that, it establishes that nothing can withstand analysis. So there's a sort of a fourfold way, which is although it's an Indian a sort of analysis, the idea is that something is either exist from a cause, or from no cause, or from neither cause nor not cause, or from both cause and not cause. Right? This is the sort of fourfold analysis used in traditional Indian ideas. And he says is that when we look at this carefully using this analysis, then we come to the decision that there's nothing that is not included in these four, and there's nothing therefore available. And we can say, for instance, that when we talk about it like the existence of an effect, the non-existence of effect, both the existence and non-existence of effect, neither the existence nor the existence of the effect. Therefore, because none of these work for us, as we can't say it exists, we can't say it doesn't exist. Therefore, we can establish that it doesn't exist at all. And likewise, because we've included all phenomena, then when we have this idea, we say, well, when we're in a state of enlightenment, an enlightened mind of having developed everything, we're meditating on emptiness, then we imagine that we perceive reality, the production, cessation, things arising and falling, bondage and freedom, or samsara and enlightenment. All of these things don't exist at all. And therefore, because this is how an enlightened mind sees them, then this is how it is, and these things do not exist. So this is interesting, Rinpoche says, because actually when Nagarjuna or any of the other Madhyamakas, middle way practitioners or scholars say actually production and such do exist, then we think, oh yes, oh no, this is just a skillful means, this is just a way of saying things, because if are they really capable of this analysis, and if so, then they would withstand analysis, and therefore they would exist. And if not, then how is it possible for them to exist? Because they can be rationally refuted. Right? This is how our minds work, like this. We say, okay, we can use these rational arguments, we can cut it down, we can break it out, we can find out that there's nothing there, so therefore there's nothing there. And then the scholars of the middle way say, well, these things do exist, and they say, but does valid cognition, do the way in which we perceive them in terms of what is valid cognition? So when we have a correct perception of something, when we're able to see it, does a valid perception see it? Not a occluded one or a broken one, but one that's actually clear. So not a deluded one, but a valid perception. And such Madhyamakas, such the great meditators and scholars say, yes, definitely, a valid conception, perception sees this cup, and a valid sense base tastes the tea, and so on. So this is sort of like that, yes. And they say, well, since the sublime wisdom of an enlightened mind, perceiving reality, perceives production as non-existent, then it is hang on, is that right? No, I've jumped. Sorry, I've jumped. So, no, I haven't. No, that's correct. So they say, since sublime wisdom, this enlightened mind, perceiving reality, does not see these as being production, as being available, or so on, then it is impossible for this, because it's not there in this wisdom, that this production cannot be. And I say this production being this sort of cup of tea. So they can't see the cup of tea, right? So I mean, production's a bit hard for us to work on. So we're saying I can't see a cup of tea. Sublime wisdom can't see a cup of tea, so therefore there's no cup of tea there, right? And and then what? So therefore it can't be a valid cognition to see it, right? And we say, but look, our conventions, the way in which we talk about or see it, and just using our normal mind, right? Nothing special. We can see there's a cup of tea here. If we are mistaken in our view of understanding emptiness, we might say, no, 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 no. Conventional consciousnesses aren't valid. The way in which, just because I see that, this doesn't mean that it's a valid cognition at all. For instance, the King of Concentration Sutra says the eye, the ear, nose, consciousness, and so on are not valid cognitions. And likewise, the tongue, the body, the mental are also not valid cognitions. Right? They don't see what is actually there. And if they were, what would be the path? What would be the point of the path? We'd already naturally be enlightened. And Chandrakirti himself, within the middle way, says, the world is not valid in any way. And therefore, it's easy for us, if we're not clear about our minds, we can say, but these things do not exist in the way because they're not valid. And we cannot, we can't accept that. Mm. I say then also, okay, well, if we are to talk about the cup of tea and so on, then because it can't be demonstrated to be finally here in the middle way, then it has to be present conventionally. But that would be unreasonable too, because the Chandrakirti says the arguments which talk about production and non-production through looking at production of self, is something arising from the self, or is it from itself, or does it arise from something else, or both, or neither, is not tenable in the context of ultimate and final reality. It also shows that it's not even tenable conventionally. So therefore, they say that or we can say, well, if we're unclear in our minds, that when we that the demonstration that refutes or rational analysis refutes ultimate production or ultimate cup of tea as being a real objective thing, also refutes it conventionally. Conventionally just means normally, like a normal, what we normally deal with. So finally is what really is there presently. So when I use the word ultimate, it doesn't mean it's some sort of special sort of ultimate Power Ranger. It just means the thing that's whatever is really present after, without, on its own, in the actual truth of things. And the conventional is just the way in which we deal with things on a day-to-day life. So we're talking about these two ideas really of the way in which we interact with the world, but the way in which the world really is in its nature. So this is important, really. So then when they're doing these four types of argument again, he says, we can imagine that because it doesn't make any sense for something to be produced from within itself, and it doesn't make any sense for it to be produced from another, and there's also both and without any cause at all, then he says, well, none of this is also tenable or reasonable because Chandrakirti says such and such in his text. So there's a couple of technical aspects about the interpretation of Chandrakirti here, in terms of the fact that because he says this, then therefore we shouldn't be qualifying ultimate finally in its nature when we're talking about production and cups of tea and so on, because Chandrakirti refutes the addition of this by saying, it happens both, not even in the world, not even conventionally. And so that it can be that we believe that essentially that these things are, that a cup doesn't even exist conventionally, while others do accept it and say that it does exist conventionally. However, he says that all of these views are based upon some sort of thing about thinking that we're middle way practitioners, thinking we understand Madhyamaka, thinking that essentially it's this rational refutation of essential or intrinsic nature, because he refutes intrinsic existence. Intrinsic means, again, so it on its own side, right? On its side. So they say that this idea of the middle way is that we basically refute the existence on its own side. And he does this, but in terms of both the conventional and also the ultimate. And therefore, if something doesn't really exist on its own side, how else could it exist? Right? So this is the point. So this sort of essentially, this is quite complicated, but what we're saying is that if something in the end doesn't exist on its side, then how else could it exist? And if we come to the conclusion that because it doesn't exist on its own side finally, therefore it doesn't exist, then we are making a huge mistake. And this is what Rinpoche is really going through very, very carefully to identify. So this is now what Rinpoche is going to do for us. So he's not going to necessarily argue directly the case, but he will do that over time. We're going to be very, very, he's going to hammer this point very strongly. So Nagarjuna, remember Nagarjuna was the author of the Madhyamaka, the Middle Way tradition. And Chandrakirti was about 8 centuries later, or 7 centuries later than Nagarjuna. And we recognize both in terms of the earlier area, we recognize both as being completely valid scholars. So the point here isn't whether or not Chandrakirti is wrong. What we're saying is Chandrakirti has been misinterpreted quite severely in terms of what it is that he was saying. So Rinpoche is going to go back to the root of the Madhyamaka, the root of the middle way teachings, which is Nagarjuna. And in the 60 stanzas of the 60 verses of reasoning is a very well-known text that he wrote. He says, in it, he has a verse, and it's written in verse. He says, through all the benefit of this text, may all beings amass the collections of merit and wisdom and attain the two sublime embodiments that arise from merit and wisdom. This means the Dharmakaya and the Nirmanakaya of Buddhahood. So essentially, it's a very poetic way of saying that from the benefits of having writing this verse, may all beings, all beings arise and develop the skills and the insight to be able to achieve enlightenment, Buddhahood. And Rinpoche explains this. So I've done it, but I'm here, and Rinpoche does it too. He says what it means is that those of us who progress through the Mahayana vehicle will, when we reach our goal, when we have attained it finally, we will have the sublime embodiment of truth, the mind of a Buddha, and the sublime embodiment of form. It's the Nirmanakaya, the form of Buddha. And this attainment, which is what the entire Lamrim has been about, is based upon having brought together immeasurable collections of merit, of good deeds, of everything that is required for us to achieve serenity, of shine, from serenity, and likewise to be able to have the power and vision and benefits to see clearly. And this is what merit gives us, is this incredible wealth of experience and freedom. And likewise, then the immeasurable collection of wisdom, insight, being able to see very clearly. These two are inseparable. So we might think, oh, all I need to do is do insight, but all I need to do is we don't. We need to do both, right? So this itself, in order for us to develop the practice of giving, patience, tolerance, ethical discipline, effort, and so on, all of these qualities depend upon us understanding different things in the world. We need to understand Dharma. We need to understand all sentient beings. We need to all understand the basis of compassion. We need to understand the 12 interdependent links. We need to understand the Four Noble Truths, all these many different things. We need to understand it. It's no good if we do not. We need to acknowledge them, right? We also need to understand their nature, right? This insight, which is what we're talking about. So once we understand, and this in terms of the diversity of understanding all the different things which I've just talked about, and when we recognize the relationship of causality, of the consequences of actions, right? This is known as cause and effect. So the relationship of cause and effect, conventional cause and effect, when we recognize this, such that we see that beneficial effects arise from beneficial causes, and toxic events arise from toxic causes, right? When we begin to recognize this, then as a time, as well as developing these qualities, we must achieve this insight that recognizes the real nature, the final nature of all objects, right? And this is a profound and deep, unconscious even, certainty that we develop through meditation, that all phenomena lack even a particle of intrinsic nature. That's a nature on its side, right? It exists on its side, on its own, independently. And therefore, we need to have both very, very clear and certain knowledge of both the diversity of all different phenomena and all the Dharma. We need to understand how causality works. We need to be very, very clear about this, as well as the final nature, the real nature of these things, not one or the other. We can't just say, oh, because it's empty, it doesn't exist, I don't need to worry about it. It's just rubbish, or it's just skillful means, or it's just method is not important because what I need to do is the insight. And that's not true. So we have to practice both. We have to practice both the method and the wisdom from the depths of our hearts. That's the only way that we can achieve enlightenment. Even a small insight, right, requires both of these. So he says this is the key, really, to the path that leads to the enlightenment of the two embodiments of a Buddha, right, the mind and the body, right. When the result is eventually reached. He says whether or not we get it right completely depends upon our understanding of the basic situation. So we need to establish certain knowledge of the two truths, conventional, final truth, but we need to understand the truth of the convention. We need to understand the truth of the ultimate, the final. We need to understand the truth, the underlying truth of all phenomena, both in terms of where they are in convention and how they work and so on, and also how they are in their own essence, on their side, or how they're not. How they're not, right? This is the final nature. So he says this is really important because until we've actually pierced the middle way philosophy, and it's very, very confusing at first, until we understand it, we're completely confused. And it just seems completely contradictory that we can talk about the conventional truths as being legitimate and real and absolutely necessary, and that the final nature of the ultimate or final nature of reality is such that there's no intrinsic, there's nothing there intrinsically, right? When we first hear this, we're like, that just is confusing. It doesn't make any sense. But once we developed the middle way view, the view of Nagarjuna, once we've actually recognized Madhyamaka, once we've got what Nagarjuna says, then not only is there no contradiction, there's not even a trace of contradiction. And then when we do that, then we begin to understand, and then it's much easier for us to correlate. And then we begin to understand how the underlying message of what Buddha was saying from the second sermon he ever gave, it all begins to make a huge amount of sense. And when this happens, there's a huge sense of respect for Shakyamuni Buddha, for Buddha, who was around 2,500 years ago, and also for the Dharma, for his talks. And we begin to see why the message of Buddha is relevant today. Yeah. So even though it's been 2,500 years later, we recognize this insight, this tiny insight, which is so pervasive and so important in terms of its consequences once we've got it. And at this point, he says, what Rinpoche says here, when we recognize it, we say, we sort of feel inside ourselves this praise to Buddha, which is like the meaning of emptiness, right? The emptiness of intrinsic existence is dependent arising, right? Is dependent arising. It does not mean that things do not exist. It doesn't mean that they're empty of the capacity to function. So the fact that something is empty of intrinsic existence does not mean it's not able to function, and it does not mean it doesn't exist. It means that it arises completely dependently, right? It's a dependent. Therefore, it's not independent, right? So the point about this is to say that when we recognize that if it were existing on its side in its own way, that it would be independent, it would exist independently. And what we're saying is it cannot, it has to exist independence. Therefore, it is not independent. Independent and independent is really hard for me to get clear. Being independent means standing on its own. Existing in dependence means it cannot exist on its own. It has to exist only because of a collection of other things. And why is that important? Is because the way in which we perceive it is as if it is there on its own, standing right there. Yeah. So when we talk about, something that we have that's precious, when we start thinking about my lovely this, so my necklace, we imagine that it exists on its own. We don't see it as being existing in a dependence upon a whole construction of other causes. It seems to be valid on its own right. So like in just the way, in the same way we're talking about in terms of impermanence, where we see it as also being permanent, it's sort of persistent from one moment to the next. We know that actually all the molecules are sort of moving within it all the time. Or if we've done any physics, we know that this movement is an aspect of heat. Therefore, it's like, it's continually, it's prone to change. It is continually changing from moment to moment, but we don't see it. And the way in which we grasp at it is that it is persistent without change, and also that it exists on its side, because we grasp at it as being something but we're able to grasp. When we recognize that it doesn't have an intrinsic or independent nature, then it no longer is efficacious in terms of it being something of concrete value in that same way. So we therefore have a different relationship with it. Doesn't mean it doesn't stop. It is not able to function as a teacup, for instance, but it doesn't mean that it exists independently as a teacup. So Mm. We're going to go into more detail and more clarity with this, so maybe I should shut up. So it says anybody, many Buddhists sort of still feel that the cup might be here, and even though they might consider themselves, we might consider ourselves to be middle way practitioners, if we're still tied on to the idea that it's there. We can recognize one of the qualities that's a mistake is that if we sort of think to ourselves, if things are empty, they lack any essence or intrinsic nature, if they don't exist on their side in any way whatsoever, not even a tiny bit, right? Completely, there's nothing on their side that establishes their existence, right? Then therefore all the teachings, all Dharma, all the teachings on samsara and nirvana and suffering and freedom and so on, they're all untenable. They don't make any sense. Yeah, if we have this view, then we're mistaken. We've missed the point. And in fact, he says, Nagarjuna says, this is, was raised by his own students. So he says, stating this point of view, if we have this point of view, in a verse. So he says, if all these were empty, there wouldn't be any arising, there wouldn't be any disintegration. Things wouldn't come into existence, they wouldn't go out of existence. And it would follow that for us, then, the Four Noble Truths wouldn't exist, right? So this is the idea that if something is empty of existing on its own side, then therefore existence, coming into existence, going out of existence, in even the Four Noble Truths, even the truths of the Buddhists are not possible. They're not tenable. And again, he says, another verse, he says, if all things are completely without intrinsic nature, if they don't exist on their side, then your words also lack intrinsic nature, and therefore they cannot refute intrinsic existence, right? And it is the idea of saying this. This is sort of a joke, but it's sort of like saying, if you say to me that this doesn't have a intrinsic nature, then nor can your words. And if they can't, then they can't prove anything, and they can't disprove anything. And therefore, following the idea that there was no intrinsic nature, then therefore the processes of refutation and proof are completely unable to establish anything, because they're not, they have no intrinsic nature, right? So he says this is important because what we're doing here is establishing that if we have the view that something that if we adopt the view that a lack of I say intrinsic just means there's the cup is saying, I'm here, I'm a cup, I'm here on my own, I'm a real cup, I live here, right? This idea, yeah. So this, that cup, I'm really here, that sort of sense of, oh, well, right, yeah. So the hi. Sorry. So I got moths. It's spring. So this sort of thing, intrinsic just means on its side, right? So this view essentially is again is whether or not things whether or not if it doesn't exist on its side, then therefore it doesn't exist, and it also therefore if it follows that arguments and proofs and so on don't exist. It also follows that if it's not intrinsic, it's not able to function, right? So it's not able to do its job, such as an argument is no longer able to do its job because it lacks intrinsic existence. So this is one of the things the Rinpoche says is that a distinguishing feature of Madhyamaka, what makes we can say that one of the qualities of the middle way view of Nagarjuna, is that it's acceptable for all of the teachings of Buddhism about cyclic existence, about nirvana, all of the aspects of being able to prove or disprove in argument, all of the natures of things, such as their ability to rise and fall, all of these things are all possible. They all actually are available to us without there being even a particle of essential or intrinsic existence. So, Nagarjuna is saying essentially that your argument, you might use this argument that, which is that everything is untenable because of its lacking intrinsic existence, is just wrong when it comes to emptiness. It's missing the point. Therefore, you've given up on emptiness in this way, and it's not suitable for me. If you recognize, if you understand emptiness, if you actually get the point about emptiness, remember, emptiness is the emptiness of this intrinsic existence. If we understand it, everything makes sense. Everything makes sense to us. But if we don't understand it, nothing makes sense. So this point about it is to say, when we begin to recognize correctly the lack of intrinsic existence, everything begins to make sense to us. If we do not understand it, then we're going to remain confused. And Rinpoche then mentions that Chandrakirti also adds his own commentary on these very verses. Although he doesn't actually, all he does is say Nagarjuna is right in this case, I think. So there's not really very much more to add in this particular case. Now, in Nagarjuna wrote a book called the Fundamental Treatise of the Middle Way. It was also known as the Madhyamika Karika, or some people call it the MMK, Madhyamika Karika. So the Fundamental Treatise, which is the core text, the original text of the Middle Way view. And he says that the 26th chapter really teaches the stages of production of how things come into existence through knowing the 12 factors of dependent arising, right? So we can begin to understand how everything arises and falls by looking at the 12 interdependent links, or the 12 factors of dependent arising, same thing. And also we can look at how we can be liberated from samsara by looking at them in reverse. So once we've established insight, then how everything collapses as well, right? And then Rinpoche says, so this is the 26th chapter of the text. It says the other 25 chapters are mainly demonstrating the refutation or the removal of the object of negation. They're demonstrating the lack of intrinsic existence, which is the object to be negated. The thing that everything is empty of is this intrinsic existence, the idea that things exist, the actual truth of the idea that things, not the idea, that things do not have an intrinsic existence. They don't exist on their side. Existence, we're talking about existence, intrinsic existence. Does this cup exist, right? Or does it not exist? So it's not, this isn't a philosophy. It's not a philosophy. It sounds like a philosophy question, right? Is this cup here? Is it not here? It sounds just like epistemology from my learning philosophy at school. I'm not asking from a point of view of philosophy. I'm asking you, ask myself, is this cup here? Does it exist? Yeah. And what we're saying is, yeah, it exists. Of course it exists. I can drink from it. But does it exist on its own side? The way in which we perceive it? And that's the answer is no. So that sort of thing there is essentially when we recognize that we imbue existence on its own side, this is intrinsic existence. And this is what it doesn't have. This is what we put on it. We sort of imbue it with this in terms of the way in which we see things, the way in which we talk about things, the way in which we feel about things. And more importantly, how we see ourselves. Right. So we see ourselves as existing on our own side. Yeah. Okay. So then we're beginning to get a little bit of understanding there. So he says, even though only one chapter, the 26th chapter, is really talking about the stages of production and cessation in terms of the nature of things, and the others are talking about refuting this intrinsic existence. He says it's important to carry sorry, the 24th chapter, I skipped a bit. The 24th, so he said the 26th is about understanding the nature of independent arising through the 12 factors. He says the other ones mainly refute intrinsic existence. The 24th chapter talks about the Four Noble Truths. And it's this one, he says, demonstrate that actually, if we really understand, if we look carefully, in fact, it's impossible for us to begin to understand how things exist without them being dependent arisings. He's saying it doesn't make any sense to talk about things existing on their side, right? And it's only things become to make sense if we recognize how they exist without that quality. And he says, therefore, we must. This 24th chapter is very important for us to notice in terms of its implications, in terms of its assertion across the rest of the book or the rest of the text. So when we have the view that or even if we consider ourselves to be middle way philosophers or middle way practitioners or middle way whatever, or just middle way Buddhists, and we have this view essentially that agents, in other words, actors, if you like, and actions and consequences, if all of these things are impossible, not available to us because of if we they are fictions because of the absence of inherent existence or intrinsic existence. If we say, well, intrinsic existence doesn't allow for arising and falling, doesn't allow for actions and agency, in this case, we've missed the point. We've missed the point completely. He said, instead, what we're doing, in fact, in Nagarjuna himself, and also Lama Tsongkhapa tells us again and again that the understanding of the emptiness of intrinsic existence 100% depends upon understanding causality, agency, right? So it's when we recognize agency, when we recognize the nature of agency and agents and so on, and their relationship, that we can establish the lack of the essential or intrinsic existence, because of the fact that things are made independence upon the clay and the construction and so on. They cannot have that intrinsic existence. He says, therefore, he says in the 24th chapter of his text, that which arises dependently we explain as being emptiness. In other words, if it arises dependently, it cannot exist on its side. And this emptiness, this lack of intrinsic existence, is dependent designation. It allows for dependent designation, is the designation dependently as well, and this is the middle way. So there are two separate things here. One of them is the way in which we designate or identify something is also dependent upon our designation and the way in which we use it in terms of the conventions of the world, right? But also in terms of the way in which it arose, it is also dependent. Therefore, it has absolutely nothing in it that is existent on its side alone, standing alone. This is the middle way. When we really understand that clearly, then we can see clearly how these things are. And he says, because there is no phenomena whatsoever, there is nothing in the universe, internally in our thoughts, our minds, externally in terms of the material world or so on, everything, because there is nothing that is not dependently arising, that arises in dependence upon other aspects or causes and so on. Therefore, there is nothing which is not empty. Okay, so essentially, rather than thinking, karma and so on, or cause and effect, cause and consequence can't happen if there isn't some form of intrinsic or existence on this side, or essential existence on this side. In fact, it's quite the opposite. If we do not have karma and so on, then things cannot exist. They can't exist at all. So the very nature of our world depends upon this lack of intrinsic existence, not its presence. And yet we are so convinced, absolutely convinced it's the other way. Now, science absolutely agrees with this. There's no doubt about it. So if you look at any modern work at all in science or physics or whatever, says everything arises in dependence upon other aspects. There is nothing that exists independently of itself. But the way in which it's used is done in a very closed manner, rather than thinking about how we can use this nature, this truth, to actually liberate ourselves. So the fact that some scientists are able to see this clearly does not necessarily mean they're able to apply it to themselves, or the way in which they think about themselves. So the aspect of this is not necessarily completely hidden to all Buddhists, but what is true is that using this as a way to pierce or to cut through our grasping nature is a Buddhist quality. So this idea of saying, when we recognize this and we are able to apply it, then we can begin to let go of our grasping, our clinging and our thirst. And so therefore, he says, the Rinpoche is saying here, that therefore that anything that arises, that is a dependent arising, that arises and dependent upon causes and conditions, for instance, they're necessarily empty of, do not have any form of intrinsic existence. They cannot. He says, don't make the mistake of saying that what is dependent upon causes and effects must therefore intrinsically exist, right? Exist on its side. So it might be that all my words are confusing, and I'm sorry for that. It might also be that it's like, yeah, well, it's obvious, Ben, but it's not. If we look, for instance, there's a well-known paradox in Western philosophy called Sorites, So Socrates is a very, very simple idea. And it's essentially, there are two variations of this. Now, I'll leave it with you as a thought experiment. One of them is where you have a table and you have a bag of rice, and you put a grain of rice in the same place or in the same area on the table. At what point does a heap of rice appear? So we know that at one point or another, we need to have so many rice before that is a heap of rice. At some point, there will be a heap of rice on the table. And the other way of looking at it is saying we have a heap of rice on the table. I take one grain of rice away from that heap at a time, one away at a time. When does the heap vanish? And where does it go to? Where's that heap gone, right? So these sorts of questions are considered to be paradoxes within Western philosophy, or they're considered to be sort of funny puzzles because of the idea that there's somehow something on its side that makes it a heap. Yeah. And where does the heap go? So when we're still imagining that there's something on that side, we have to then explain where does the heap suddenly arise from, and where does it go and where does it go to? So these sorts of aspects are because we're so linked into the idea of intrinsic existence, all right? The idea that things exist on their side. And so another one is to say, for instance, another one is a Western philosophy idea called Theseus's ship, and also known as a paradox. Theseus' ship says when you, Theseus, who traveled to Troy and back, and he had his ship, the ship that took him there and back, and it was his ship, and they recognized it when he arrived. But every single part of that ship, because it was such a long journey, had been replaced, had been destroyed, and so they'd replaced it. They'd had to, it lost the mast, they lost the base, they lost the oars, they lost all the different pieces of the ship had been changed. So at that point, it's like saying, well, what's left of Theseus's ship? Or how can we say that this ship is Theseus's? How do we know that it's Theseus's? Since every single part of it's gone and changed. There's no one part that's remained the same. And in the British comedy, Only Fools and Horses, that's what's known as Trigger's broom. Trigger is a guy who's a road sweep. And he says to Del Boy, I've had this broom for 20 years, and it's kept me through thick and thin. And he says, okay, I've had to change the handle 20 times, and I've had to change the broom 15 times, but this broom's kept me going the whole time. The broom be the brush 20 times, but this broom's been with me all the time. So this is just really Theseus's ship. Well, where's the broom, that he has had for 20 years? There's not one part of it that's actually that's persisted from moment to moment, and yet it's still his broom. So this is all about these assumptions of intrinsic nature or intrinsic existence like this. Who we're thinking about a little bit, not because they are jokes, but because essentially the way in which we perceive things is not so familiar with the idea that things lack this intrinsic quality. We still try to imbue it and put it on there. So then Rinpoche cites several verses from Nagarjuna. He says, I bow down to the Buddha, the unequaled supreme teacher, who taught that emptiness, dependent arising, and the middle way are all the same thing. They hold the same meaning. And he also said in the 70 verses, he said, the unequaled Buddha taught that because things are empty of intrinsic existence, they are dependent arising. So this is the other way around of looking at it, but essentially it's exactly the same sort of thing. So it's when we understand this nature that we can talk about something existing without it having to exist on its side, and that's not a mistake, it's not a contradiction, then we're beginning to get close to understanding emptiness. So he says, therefore, and importantly, he says, dependent arising does not mean that we accept the absence of intrinsic existence for ourselves as a Madhyamaka, and say all the teachings on dependently arising cause and effect, and therefore the Four Noble Truths and the Six Perfections, that they don't really belong to us, because we follow the true path of insight, which doesn't recognize this as being there, because they don't essentially exist. Nothing essentially exists, but it doesn't mean that nothing exists. And this is the whole point. He says it's completely a mistake to do that. He says, and Rinpoche says, Nagarjuna's statement in the treatise, for those whom emptiness makes sense, etc., right? The one that says emptiness makes sense, everything makes sense. For those who emptiness makes no sense, nothing makes sense, right? Everything makes sense. It means that all of the dependent arisings of cyclic existence, everything with it that is Dharma, is admissible, is acceptable, is real, is meaningful, and therefore within the scope of understanding the middle way philosophy, or the middle way view, or the middle way teaching, or middle way practice, we cannot say, this is skill in means, or this is not relevant to the path. It's not the case. We accept this, right? They're dependent arisings. Okay, so that's enough for the week. It's quite complicated, but we can do it. We just need to be to think a little bit about it. So if nothing else, think about like those puzzles from like Kuptrika's broom, or the Saratis, the heap of rice and so on. They're very useful for us to sort of think about how we actually relate to things, and where does the heap go if it is on its side, right? And then it's a bit more complicated for us. So how things exist, what we mean by that, really worthwhile considering. Anyway, so next week we're going to continue, and we're going to look at it specifically in terms of the relationship of dependent arising and emptiness, and how they balance each other out. And we'll again look at how some of us might think about it, and why we will be making a mistake if we do that. But now let's just spend before we go, let's dedicate any benefit. Consider that the advantages of being able to listen, and possibly do better than listen, and in terms of being able to be inspired, if nothing else, by my provocative remarks, to study further, or to get down to the bottom of this, to take on the mission to work towards our own enlightenment, to see the benefit that can be given to all beings through our understanding of these things. Anything like that's fantastic. So the goal really is to work towards benefiting all beings, nothing else. There are plenty of other places to find other things. This is what we're working on now. So let's now finish with a sit. Yeah, just a few minutes.